Wonderful. Well, I want you to tell us about this book, Amazing Grace. First of all, why did you decide to write it?
Well, in 2000, I was privileged to write about Mr. Eternity. This is a man who used to write the word eternity on the streets of Sydney. And we had eternity on the Harbour Bridge, on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And I sensed that God gave me the green light to write about him. Beautiful story of God's grace. Another one from a zero to a hero. And so it was very successful. We did really well as far as evangelism. In 2002, sitting at my computer and just praying and meditating and asking God what he wants me to do next. And this thought came to my heart. And what Mr. Eternity was to Sydney, Amazing Grace is to the world.
Oh, wow.
So from 2002 till 2006, I read, researched, lived, did everything I can to know about John Newton. Who he was, what he was like, how he grew.
And of course, he's the one who wrote the song Amazing Grace.
That's correct.
Well, tell us about him, because I think most viewers don't know, most didn't even know John Newton wrote Amazing Grace, and they certainly don't know about his life. So tell us about him.
His story is such a wonderful story from the very beginning, how he was, how he grew up. His mother, Elizabeth, was a godly woman. In fact, there's a terrific lesson on raising children from her. She was just a 20-year-old bride. And she basically, the way she raised him up was, first of all, she taught him how to read and write early. What a great principle to spend time with your kids. Number two, she prayed for him fervently. And number three, she took him to church regularly. And what a brilliant approach to parenting. She died before he was just 7 years old. His father remarried, and as a result, his stepmother was not interested in spiritual things, so they sent him out to boarding school. And as a result, he got involved with the wrong crowd. As the Bible says, a child left to himself, it's a disaster waiting to happen. And then all the way down till at the age of 11, that his dad took him on his first maiden voyage. And then around the age of 18, because his life was such a mess, that's by his own admission, he got involved, he was press ganged on the ship, on the Navy. And he was such a rebellious person that he wanted to get off the ship, and eventually he did. And that's when he spent about a year and a half as a slave himself. And all that before the age of 20, by the way. So what's interesting about his story, John Newton is a story for every teenager. We think about an adult, it's about teenagers. And the price of sin, and also not only this, the impact that his godly mother had on his life. Eventually, on the way back he writes to his father, and his father sends a ship to bring him across. On the way back to England, that's when he gives his heart to the Lord. And that's an amazing story in itself, because he was not planning on all of that. But the ship was sinking, and then he just calls on the Lord. And it was the 21st of March. And in his writing, he says, this day I will never ever forget. And so now, he's still very young. But he hasn't grown in the Lord quite a bit. In fact, by his own admission, he grows a bit here, a bit there. And that's what he got involved in the slave trade. Lots of time, there's a lot of myth about him being a slave trader before he was saved. Actually, he was after he was saved.
Wow, I didn't know that. I'm learning myself right here.
But we got to keep in mind the context. He was very young, personally. He was very young in the Lord. Not much discipleship and growing in grace himself. And also the culture, slave trade was like an industry. Anyway, God in his grace and mercy does not want him to be involved in that. Eventually he brings a guy called Captain Clooney his way. And so they meet, and Captain Clooney begins to disciple him. And so he begins to grow and understand. And his heart begins to get more sick of the slave trade. But he still doesn't give it up. So guess what God uses? He uses a fit.
He uses a what?
A fit, a seizure.
Oh, okay.
And he was having a cup of tea with his wife. All of a sudden he has a fit. The doctor comes, he can't go back to work. And that was a turning point in his life. And isn't that amazing how God uses this situation that we often think they are really weird. But that was the turning point in his life. And God uses that in our life many times. Situation that we don't understand, but actually it's a turning point in our lives. And so that's when he leaves, and then he wants to get ordained. And by the way, it is 250 years this year since John Newton surrendered his life to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ.
That is wonderful.
Because God can take a bad thing and turn it for good. He's excellent at doing that, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's what he did in John Newton's life.
In fact, with his conversion, it was a storm that brought him to his knees. He was nearly dying, and John Newton couldn't swim.
Oh, my.
So it was a storm. So God is a wonderful God. I say to people, just trust him.